Hello once again. I'm back. This is video 5 of the Rediscovering Peace series. And as you recall from video 4, which was the longest video, and probably if you were going to only watch one video in this entire series, video 4 would be the video to watch. And at the end of video 4, I promised that I would talk about this portion of the video 4 diagram, the becoming human, becoming humane diagram. Now, in the essence, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go back through this diagram. It is if you're interested in practicing radical kindness or experiencing practical selflessness, in knowing what I call real bliss, it's worth checking out video 4 to understand this diagram. It's enough for this video to know that this is a representation of a human lifetime. This axis is time. This axis represents the intensity of either the peace we're feeling or the suffering, from feeling bad and suffering to all the way to feeling beyond wonderful and at one with everything and everyone around us. And we start here at conception, move to birth, and this line represents death. And then depending on which choices we have made in our life, that represents where we end up on this line. And this line is what this video will be talking about. This line represents, in essence, your last conscious moment, or your last bundle of conscious moments, just before your physical body dies, and now science is showing for quite a few moments thereafter. Yeah, when you can still formulate conscious thought, but this bodily vessel is no more, is no longer functioning. What people watching from the outside would say is your death. Yeah, so. Essentially, this graph represents not only your level of either suffering or bliss during your life, it also represents how peaceful and or painful your death experience will ultimately be. This, of course, is a theory. Again, the only people who know anything concretely about the actual human death experience are the ones who have actually died and cannot share with us what they've experienced, if anything at all. That having been said, what we do know scientifically about consciousness, which is admittedly still very little, but more and more, enough to formulate this theory, tends to match with what quite a few of history's mystics and masters have had to say about the matter, from the Tibetan Buddhists who have studied it intensively all the way to Jesus himself, who spoke on it at length, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. So, essentially, and I do this at a little bit of risk, and I don't want to do any of you a disservice, if you are going to ever attain what I call Zone 3 living, which I expounded upon at length in the last video, which is essentially bliss, real joy, happiness, meaning, purpose, peace, oneness, contentment, the highest state of exaltation that a human body, mind can experience in this human body physical lifetime. It is impossible to experience that while doing anything for self, even remotely for self. Real oneness is only experienced when we are acting as one. We cannot act as one when we are acting to attain any kind of personal benefit for self. That makes complete sense. It turns out, as I've practiced this over the years, it's actually not just a theory. It's not just logical. It's true. So, that having been said, trying to be good in order to avoid a painful death experience is not being good, right? So, I apologize if this video makes it more difficult for you to be loving to others, because you might be subconsciously tempted to be loving to others in order to avoid what very well might, if not probably will, happen during your final moments. That having been said, I have faith in your strength. I have faith in your ability to live your life and to make your choices consciously, as I have done to a degree, and as many before us have done. And so it seems and feels to be important information, and so I'm going to share it anyway. Essentially, what I call this video is the 7 halls to heaven. Now, heaven, in this sense, would be here. I'm not talking about what happens after. I'm not talking about dying and then going on to have an eternity of sitting on a cloud being fed grapes by angels playing lyres with wings and massaging our temples. Whatever that vision's about. Golden paved streets and all that. It sounds incredibly boring to me. What's the point of living in eternity eating grapes? I want to help somebody. Real bliss comes from helping someone, and if everyone's happy in heaven, it just sounds like frankly, I'd rather be down in hell helping somebody who was suffering, but maybe that's just me. Point being, I'm not talking about any of that. The only person who knows anything about that is no one alive today. We're all going to be surprised. And yet, heaven, when I say the term, means that experience of oneness, that moment when your separateness completely melts away and your consciousness does indeed, at least for a fleeting moment, meld with everything around it, and it can be nothing other than perfectly peaceful by its very nature. There can be no more conflict because there is nothing to conflict with. You are one with everything. Now, what becomes interesting here is that time is measured mentally by the human body and the functioning human brain. Time is a malleable construct. We all know that when we're doing a job at work that is horrifically boring, time stretches and just seems to last forever. And at the same time, if we're taking a walk in the park, holding hands with a newfound loved one, that 4 hours seems like 10 minutes. It's time. It is actually bent and changed and molded and reformed by our perceptions, by the emotions we're having at the time, by how we're focusing our attention and on what and why we're focusing our attentions. So time is and the perception of time is molded and ruled and regulated by the human body and the human brain. Okay? Now, when that body dies, there is at least one instant, if not, science apparently last month, the research is now apparently showing that there can be conscious thoughts, or what can be termed a consciousness, that is viable for several moments, if not several minutes, after a physical body dies. I know that a decapitated chicken's head, or I guess any sentient being's head, but they measure this with chickens, remains conscious and experiences pain and suffering and fear for 30 seconds after it's decapitated. So it actually makes sense that whatever consciousness is can, at least for an instant, and I'm not even going to say 5 minutes, I'm going to say an instant, after or at the instant when the human body and the human brain cease to function, there is an instant of time, right, that consciousness persists. Yeah? And what's important to note about that is, in this instant of time, in this, maybe longer, but we'll say an inkling of a moment, that consciousness is in existence in its last inkling, while its body and body-mind has ceased to exist, has ceased to function, there is nothing left with which that consciousness can use to measure time. And that inkling of an instant is perceived to be eternal, or feels as though it were infinite, or approaching infinity, stretching onward through the horizon. Okay? Now, to people looking on the outside, watching the person breathe their last breath, we see this as the, and then it's over, or the last convulsion, or the last eye blink, or the last word, and then the body is dead, and we see that that person has passed. And at that point they have body passed, they have made this journey in that inkling of time, which is so small a window that we cannot even perceive it. We just see that this is just one inkling, and they're just gone. Some cultures say that you should leave a body in status for 3 days, because it takes 3 days for this entire process to leave, for all of the conscious essence and the life essence of a conscious being to leave its body. Maybe so, but we're just sticking with an inkling. An inkling is enough, because an inkling, even an instant of time, without a body mind to measure time, is eternal. And of course, this is, if you keep that concept in mind, and then go back, for example, and read the sayings of Jesus in Matthew 25, where he talks about the end of the world and the coming of the Father, and you never know when the Father's going to come, and that's why you should wake up and start being kind to people now, because... And so, the Christian church says, Jesus is talking about a second coming, this demonic presence that comes from on high with a scythe and ruthlessly picks a few handfuls of good people who are worthy to get to go to heaven forever, and just cuts the rest of them down and sends them to hell. I mean, that's, between you and me, that's not really a God you want to be worshiping. That's a God you're morally obligated to protest and disobey. But that, just putting that out there. But if that's inconsistent, you see, because that interpretation of those passages, and I'm not saying Jesus actually said those things, but assuming he did, assuming he existed, assuming he said those things, that is in direct contradiction to everything else he says previously about the unconditional perfect love of his Heavenly Father, and everything that he taught, which was about forgiveness and mercy and grace and humility and non-judgment and reaching out to those who have sinned or are seen deemed less than and enemies, right? So what else could he be saying? Well, if you think about this moment of our lives, and you remember or think about the fact that this last instant of time could very well be perceived by the dying one as an eternal moment, or a very, 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 very long moment, a stretched out instant, right? And if the consciousness still existed and still had, of course, its access to memory during that time, that eternity would either be perceived as the wrath of God, had that being lived a selfish life, taking care of itself at the expense of others, or it would be perceived as bliss, the kingdom of heaven, had that being chosen to transcend selfishness and serve rather than be served, care rather than hoard, right? So that's one thing that's nice, is it takes these horrific sounding verses in many of the Gospels, and you're just wondering, what did Jesus eat? Why is he sick to his stomach? Why is he speaking so ruthlessly? When you read it through these glasses, it makes perfect sense. He's just saying, look, you don't know when you're going to die. And when you do die, based on how you've chosen to live, your last eternal seeming moment is going to be proportionately either horrifically uncomfortable or blissful before you transition on to whatever is in the mysterious hereafter, if anything at all. Okay? So, quite a few cultures, not only Jesus in those interpretations of those sayings, but quite a few cultures and traditions have spoken similarly. This is not only found in the more deep or more in-depth interpretations of what Jesus has to say. There's a religion who calls itself the Rosicrucians, and they kind of take it's pseudo-biblical based, but it mixes in with the teachings of Rudolf Steiner, and they believe that there are 7 heavenly halls that one has to pass through from the moment of physical death to the moment of energetic or spiritual reunification, right? Whatever happens after here, yeah? Tibetan Buddhists have written extensively on this and mentions similar phases that one goes through, and so I'm just going to mention them and reference them to the workbook. Okay, this is the workbook. This accompanies this presentation, this workbook does. And as I've mentioned in other videos, you can download it for free or read it online without trouble. Just go to my website, inspiringthealtruisticmoment.com, link in the box below. Go to the writings page, and you'll see it right there. Click on it, and you can either read it or download it. So when I reference page numbers in a few moments to how we can make this a more peaceful time and prepare for it, you can start preparing for this now, is what the masters of all sorts of religions and spiritual practices have told us. And it seems logical to me and reasonable to assume that we can indeed prepare for this time. And I want to briefly talk about that, and then this video will be done. So when I refer to page numbers, that's this book that I'm referring to. So the 7 heavenly halls, I'm going to put them as colored balls, colored spheres, and the archetype of the color matches the archetype of the challenge, right? Red is not only courage, but it's fear. So that's the most primal of archetypes, and it's down here. So as we've talked about before, if you're going to live a life based on manipulating others, based on intentionally causing other beings to suffer just for your personal pleasure, for example, milkshakes, hamburgers, enough on that. If you're going to be aggressive towards others, if you're going to have opportunities to help those in need and you hide from them, excuse me, that's the realm of fear, right? This is an emotional existence, a primal existence, an existence based in pure selfishness. And so if you have lived a life that has spent a large portion of your time down here, right, then whatever degree of your life you've lived in this red archetype, that's the degree of that stuff you're going to have to go through and cleanse or be exposed to and pierce on your way to peace. That way you can actually start cleansing that one, not only by, you can cleanse all of these simultaneously by self-sacrificing joyfully for others. Everything I've been talking about up to now. And yet you can also individually cleanse them using the workbook. And so if you'd like to do a little cleansing work on the red hall, right, that's on page 18, just to get you started. And you can, you don't have to do exactly what's on page 18, but it's there for you if you want. The orange archetype deals with desire, right? That's right around here. It's probably actually a little closer to the red ball. It's also pretty much, red and orange are really close together down here in zone 1, but you guys get the picture. This is seeking pleasure and hoarding material things, right? Owning more than we need to own, refusing to share, all activities dealing with lust and addictions, right? And the degree to which you have not transcended these and chosen to give anyway, right? It's kind of a taking archetype. And if you, to the degree to which you've chosen to make your life about taking as opposed to giving, that would be the next level of high discomfort you would have to pierce on your way to oneness. If you'd like to kind of pre-cleanse that one, there's some hints on how you can do so on page 19 of the workbook. Okay? The next one is convention. It's the yellow archetype. And by very nature, the fact that you have clicked on these videos and are watching them means that you are at least willing to abandon traditional views. You are at least willing to abandon convention and consider different conventions, different norms than the ones you've been taught you have to subscribe to, right? So the fact that you're all here means you've already cleaned a lot of this. There's certainly a lot more to be cleansed. You've done a lot already. Well done. But convention has to do with your judgments, behaving in a way not because it's right, but because it's normal. When you know that there's something else you could have done that would have been more courageous or more correct or more helpful, right? You just stick to the norm. Kind of a good example of that is when you see someone being bullied, do you step in, right? If a large group is bullying a person who you also maybe not like, do you step in to stop the bullying, or do you just go with the norm, right? If someone's being gossiped about, do you attempt to stop the gossip? Do you defend the person behind their back? Do you say something positive about them as opposed to gossiping with? These are all challenges dealing with the yellow hall, yeah, and you can deal more with that on page 20 if you wish. The green archetype has to do with compassion, the opposite of which is apathy, which is a really big challenge for Zone 2 people. Because what happens in Zone 2, as we talked about in the last, that's not a very harmonious color. Can we make that a little, there, that's a little better. What we talked about in the last video, Zone 2 is a very intellectual level. You know that this emotionally fear-directed life is not a good one, causes a lot of harm. And so you move to the mental level. And what happens when we live a mental existence where we try to cleanse the mind or calm the mind doing yoga or meditation, when we try to read self-help books to intellectually comprehend enlightenment, right? When we go to church and say the right things and do the right religious practices in order to attain inner peace, which is kind of a mental experience, yeah? When we choose to live this relatively self-centered, well-intended, much better than this, and yet still relatively self-centered, highly mental existent, intellectual existence, what suffers is your empathy and your ability to have compassion for those who are suffering. A great example of this is, I'll mention it again, Carolyn Myss talks about sacred contracts, how people have entered this world, and those who are suffering because they have chosen that suffering purposefully in order to transcend it somehow, and they made that choice before they entered their fleshly body and were born, right? So sometime before here, they chose to come back. I chose to come back as Scaughdt, right, and go through the challenges that I've gone through. That's generally the theory, yeah. Now, very well may be. Doesn't seem to be very accurate. Doesn't resonate with what I've experienced, but who knows? I mean, I'm no authority on that. And yet, assuming that's true and you subscribe to that theory, an offshoot of that is you see someone suffering, and rather than reach out with heartfelt empathy and are inspired to aid them and offer them assistance, what I've often actually heard people say and seen them do is they kind of turn aside and say, oh, well, he chose that. Or, oh man, I wonder why she chose that suffering, right? And then they walk off. And the sufferer is still suffering, and the chance was there to actually help them and ease their suffering, which is why we're here. We're not plants. We're not rooted in the ground. We can move. We can hug things. We can care for people. We can go towards suffering and do our best, whatever we can, even if it's only a little bit, to try to ease that suffering, right? And so a real challenge for Zone 2 folks is apathy, callousness, becoming a distanced observer of life as opposed to an involved participant, risking emotional harm in order to care for those in need, right? So if you live this intellectual life, and you die here, and then what you haven't cleaned up here, that's going to be an interesting time, to say the least, having to pierce through all of that apathy and remember that and, feel it again, and, it's better to live caringly, let's just put it that way. Better just to risk it all, drop the intellectual stuff, and just look for people in pain and try to help them, even if you can't succeed in doing so. Just try to be kind to people in need. The next hall I call the Hall of Sloth, right? Kind of sloth. It's the blue archetype. It's a lighter blue, but I don't have an indigo pen, so I just had to use a lighter blue here. This is actually blue, the archetype. It's productivity, it's your vocational service, it's your actions. And What happens here is you get stuck in what's called, the myth of productivity. You have to be doing things and doing. And it is good to do things. It's just that what happens is we get caught up in fulfilling obligations, satisfying routines, meeting expectations, doing our duties, right? Striving for success, be that financial success or respect and reward from without, from external sources, from other people. And this also precludes us from actually caring, right? Productivity, self-oriented, always stops us from being capital P productive, which is this moment, here and now, who can I help, find the nearest person, do it. If there's no one around, there's garbage to pick up, or a tree to talk to, hug, right? Or, there's pretty much always someone around. The world is becoming really highly populated, and pretty much every human being you come across could really stand to be smiled at and given some sort of compliment, if not a hug, at some point, in any moment of your life, okay? But if you're always focused on being productive, busy, right? Or sitting back and just enjoying your life, which is the opposite. The flip side coin of sloth is entertainment, being entertained, right? Nothing wrong with it, and it certainly is not doing anybody any good. It's not bringing the world any more peace or joy, and it essentially amounts to a bundle of wasted moments in this body. So the degree to which you either succumb to productivity, small p, and or sloth, like in entertainment, just pleasuring yourself mentally and not doing anything, that's that hall that has to be pierced. And then the next hall is, of course, hubris or pride or arrogance, right? That's up here. And Zone 3, folks. Oh, sorry, I forgot to tell you the page numbers on that. Yeah, page 20 to deal with the yellow door. The callousness archetype, that's page 21. And, of course, this slothwood, page 22 in the workbook. There's some hints on how you can pre-clean those. Here you got page 23 is the arrogance hall. This not only deals with being proud that you have approached piercing the veil, but sometimes even being proud that you do pierce the veil. This happened to me. I was so impressed with myself that I actually did this that I immediately shot back down to here for a while, because I was really proud of myself, and it's really nothing to be proud of. All we're doing is returning to our true essence. It's not like we're accomplishing anything. We're just erasing the garbage and choosing to be what we can, capital B, be, right? But I was all proud or believing that we have the right way. This also happened to me in the beginning. I had this dynamic, and I worked out this diagram, and I was beginning to teach it to people. And that was my problem. I thought I was teaching it to people. And I wasn't teaching anything. I was sharing it and reminding them of what they already knew. And I thought it was the way when it was only a way. Yes, it's the only way of thousands I've tried that works, and yet it still is only a way. There might be another way, right? It was only the only way that I have been able to discover in my 12 years of radical living and experimentation with truth and love and kindness. But hey, I'm not the authority, right? No one is. So that would have to be cleansed to the degree that you're still suffering for that or still suffered from that. And finally, of course, you have the final hall, which even the highest level of Zone 3 individuals must pass through. No matter how much you cleansed these previous 6, there is the ego. There is your sense of separate self. And it doesn't really matter. Page 24 will help you pre-cleanse this, though you're going to have to pierce this one no matter what. You could live a life sacrificing joyfully for your vilest enemy every day and be humming along beautifully, going back up here every morning and every afternoon to a really high level of Zone 3 existence, and you were just radiating peace throughout your environment and inspiring thousands of people to be kinder in their lives, and you could really blow the roof off, and still when you die, you're still leaving a separate vessel that is ruled still primarily, no matter how enlightened you may seem, you're still ruled by your reptile brain, which is always working a quarter of a second faster than your neocortex can turn on. And the neocortex is the only part of your brain that can choose to do this. This has to be chosen. This is innate, right? This is even innate to a degree because it's in response to discomfort here. It's still self-centered. This has to be chosen consciously. It's a difficult choice to make. Yeah. So, as long as your brain is functioning, you're going to continue to return here, right? And no matter how high you're humming when you pass, right, there is going to be a last veil to go through. Though, I can imagine that probably you'd mix that parting of the ego stress would probably be mixed in with a brilliant, seemingly eternal knowledge that you had really done fantastic work. I can imagine that if you spend a chunk of your life really working just to go here, even once a day, I can imagine that not only are you going to have some regrets and some shame and some embarrassment to deal with remembering some of these times, but you're going to have a lot of deep-seated smiles and heartfelt gratitudes for all of the powerful work and courageous efforts that you did engender and enliven. Okay? So, those are the 7 heavenly halls. It makes sense to me. Worst case scenario, it's not true at all, and you pre-cleanse them, and it makes it much easier for the rest of your life to get back to here, which is where we want to spend as much time as possible. Okay? So I think that's that. I think that's it for video number 5. Yeah, I feel good about that. So, once again, love to you guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.